afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our panel presentation this afternoon, Rethinking Stereotypes, Challenging Our Perceptions. My name is Annette Johns, and I work with the Newfoundland and Labrador Association of Social Workers as the Associate Director of Policy and Practice. I will be co-moderating the panel this afternoon along with my colleague Lynn Power, who is the newly appointed Executive Director of the Association of Registered Nurses, Newfoundland and Labrador. Lynn and I have been moderating this session together for many years, and I'm pleased to say that this year marks the 10th anniversary of this wonderful partnership between both of our organizations. For the past 10 years, the NLASW and ARNL have facilitated a broad range of sessions, with the first being a session on reporting to police in 2004. Since that time, we've covered a broad range of topics, including professional liability, sharing of information, violence in the workplace, disclosure and professional responsibility, mental health and stigma, technology, clients' rights and self-determination, living with risk, and addictions. Our session today will focus on stereotypes and perceptions. Our intention each year is to bring health professionals together to raise awareness of a particular topic and to encourage thoughtful consideration and reflection. In this regard, we've been very successful in our joint effort the past 10 years. Today's session is being offered on-site at the Health Sciences Centre main auditorium and throughout the province by live webcast. This is our second year offering the session by live webcast, and we're hoping that the use of this technology makes for a more positive and engaging experience for those of you who are attending from your home computer or office computers. While this event is co-sponsored by the NLASW and ARNL, we would like to acknowledge our collaborative partners, including the Newfoundland and Labrador Health Boards Association, who provided some of the funding for this event, and the Munn School of Nursing. The format of the presentation this afternoon is a combination of information sharing, reflecting on case scenarios, and if time permits, an opportunity to ask clarifying questions. We encourage you to think about the information in the context of your own professional practice. For those of you joining by webcast, please email your questions to educationwebcast2013@gmail.com at any time throughout the panel presentation, and we'll collect them for the question and answer period. So now, on to today's topic, stereotypes and perceptions. A stereotype is an oversimplified or broad generalization about a person or group of people. These stereotypes can be positive or negative. A prejudice, on the other hand, is a judgment about a person or group based on a stereotype. And discrimination is an action or treatment of a person or group of persons which is based on a prejudice. So we can see the full circle here. As professionals, we're all aware of the different isms, including sexism, classism, racism, ableism, and heterosexism, to name a few. Stereotyping is part of our societal discourse, and our ideas about individuals and groups of people are shaped by our families, the communities in which we live, our histories and lived experiences, and the media. And I'm sure each of you can think of a stereotype, an example of a stereotype in the media or through societal discourse. And when a client or patient presents for services, it is plausible that they too may have faced prejudices and stereotypes throughout their lived experiences, based upon appearance, their economic status, their race, their gender, or their sexual orientation. So what messages have people already received about themselves when they present for service? And what has been the impact across all of the social determinants of health in their lives? For example, housing options, experiences in education, or community inclusion. Have these stereotypes become self-fulfilling prophecies? And if so, how can we challenge these stereotypes that exist in society? And what about the impact of stereotypes which are more subtle and less obvious? So as you listen to the panel discussion this afternoon, we'd like for you to consider some of the following questions. What are some of the ways in which stereotypes are perpetuated in society, our communities, and organizations? In what ways might these stereotypes be impacting on client care? And how do we recognize when these stereotypes might be impacting on client care or service delivery? Can we unlearn stereotypes? Are there any ethical, professional, or legal considerations? And how do we challenge negative stereotypes, professionally and personally? So if we achieve one goal from our session today, it is that we will have raised awareness of the impact of stereotypes and perceptions in practice generated opportunities for reflection and continued dialogue in improving client care. I now have the honor of introducing and welcoming our panelists who are going to talk about this topic for the next couple of hours. And we're extremely pleased to have assembled such a knowledgeable and experienced panel of professionals, and they've generously volunteered their time and expertise to help plan and facilitate this session this afternoon. So I'm going to start on my immediate left with George Van Slyke. George recently resumed her position as social worker with the Lewisporth Health Centre, which is a long-term care home in central Newfoundland. For the past year, George carried the role of facility manager with Carmelite House in Grand Falls, Windsor. She completed her BSW at the University of the City of Manila and her MSW at Dalhousie University. She was also involved in various multicultural advocacy and research initiatives, and in recent years, worked with temporary foreign workers in the province. She worked in child, youth, and family service settings in the Philippines and in Newfoundland prior to her current focus in gerontology. George will be continuing her work in gerontology in Nova Scotia this year, as she recently accepted a position as CEO with Grandview Manor in Nova Scotia. Nova Scotia's gain, for sure, our last. And next to George, we have Jill Allison. Jill holds a PhD in anthropology from Memorial University, and her work concentrates on medical anthropology and issues related to the intersection of health, technology, and social values. Combining experience from a long career as a nurse with an academic focus on health, Dr. Allison brings a grounded perspective to her research on topics such as infertility and reproductive technologies, healthcare as part of community networks and social ecosystems, the meaning of genetics research to people in Newfoundland and Labrador, and women's reproductive autonomy and access to safe birth control resources in underserviced countries. She has worked, volunteered, and done research in Nepal, Bangladesh, Mexico, Haiti, Ireland, Newfoundland, and other parts of Canada. Her current role as Global Health Coordinator in the Faculty of Medicine at MUN combines her academic interests and global health experiences in her work to promote health equity and social justice at home and abroad. And last but not least, next to Jill, we have Carrie Majed. Carrie was appointed Executive Director of the Provincial Human Rights Commission in July of 2008. Prior to accepting this position, Carrie articled in Ontario and worked in private practice in Newfoundland and Labrador. A graduate of the University of Waterloo in 1994 and the University of New Brunswick Law School in 1999, Carrie was called to the Ontario Bar in February of 2001 and the Newfoundland and Labrador Bar in October of 2001. So welcome to each of you. What a wonderful panel. I'm really looking forward to the presentation this afternoon. We started planning for this back in September, and once we had our great panel put together, we knew we were on the right direction to a wonderful panel this afternoon. So I'm now going to hand things over to my colleague, Lynn Power, who's just going to provide some information on the format for this afternoon.
Good afternoon, everybody. Now, I was getting a little bit of feedback, almost like something moving. Was any interference in the sound up there? Okay, could be just the way it was echoing down here, okay. And we do have an opportunity for those on webcast to send in questions, and that should be on your screen, showing up every now and then. But the same way, if there's any technical problems that you need to tell us about, you can actually send it into educationwebcast2013@gmail.com. So that's where we're taking questions, but if there's any issues, we can go there. So I'm just going to take a minute before we start our panelists off, but I want to say to you, when as well said, is our 10th year of getting together and doing this, and we always say, now what's out there? What interests nurses? What interests social workers? What's out there that's sort of gray? Not a black and white, what's the simple answer? Where do you cause your dilemmas? And when we talked about stereotypes and the biases, and I think Annette did a good introduction on it, we actually started with smaller items. You'll hear a combination of small, stereotypic bias views right up to the larger ones. But what got us when we really got sold on the topic was labels we may use. A frequent flyer coming into the emerge. That's a stereotype. All right? Those simple things, ageism, yelling, at somebody who's 80 years old just because you think they may or may not be able to hear you. So it was all of the range. So we really got engaged. We really got great discussion. And then it was, whoa, what kind of cases? Where could we go with it? So this year we decided to do a little bit different. This year we're going to have the panel reflect on a wider range, let them have a little bit more latitude rather than a set scenario, just so that they can throw in different types of commentaries for things for you to think about in your practice environment or in your work setting, so that you can gather some of the information today and apply it. So again, the way it works is that it's not a debate. It's more of a presentation style. We'll rotate between each of the speakers. They'll start off with just giving you some important information you need to know. So it very well may be a piece of legislation, a policy, some historic thing that has occurred, but they'll give you some of the salient information that you should have in the back of your mind as you consider this topic. So after we do those cross-panel presentations, then we get into the two cases, and myself and Annette will change gears, and I'll lead one, she'll lead the other. And then we will have an opportunity for a few questions at the end. We usually try to say we'd like to have clarification questions, something you weren't clear on, rather than new scenarios just because of the time limits. But we encourage you could always email it in if you have a question later, or contact your regulatory body if you're with the nursing or the Association of Social Workers, or if you're with any other discipline. This was certainly wide open. If there's some practice sort of relevant thing, maybe you might want to follow up that way. So I mentioned that the questions for those on our webcast is at educationwebcast, all one word, 2013 @gmail.com. And like I said, it should be on the screen. And the only other little formatty thing I want to mention is we do have evaluation forms. There are some in the room. Annette, are they? Okay, we have them here, and we'll distribute some because we'd love your feedback on how you found the session, and in particular, the very last question, what's the topic you'd like done for next year? So we'd love your contributions, and they are on our respective websites, so you can actually do them online as well and fill them in if you don't fill them in today. So I encourage you to give us your feedback. Oops. And that is helpful for us planning and looking at today. So I'll move right over now into the panel, and George is going to start us off.
My English very little. No, I wanted to start that just to see how you would react, because it's so easy to. I'm sure if I say that, a lot of people, when I start talking like that, I'm sure they believe me that I can actually speak English because I look it, right? But I would like to start my presentation with a quote from Thompson, which actually stated that, there's no middle ground in our profession. As a healthcare professional, there's no such thing as a middle ground. Either our intervention adds to the oppression, or it goes in some small ways in easing or breaking the cycle. And I know that I've presented about anti-oppressive practices, including stereotypes, several times for the past 2 years. And some people have said, we've heard about it, we've saturated the point, go on, move on to another body of knowledge. But the thing that's funny is that we may have a head knowledge of how fighting stereotypes should work. We may have a head knowledge of how anti-oppressive practice should work, but are we actually doing something about it? Are we challenging the remarks or jokes that we're hearing around us? Are we using terms like bed blockers, frequent flyers, or demented person? Or are we stopping and asking questions to ourselves and to the people that we work around us if that's the right thing to say, if that's the right thing to do? And I don't think we're there yet. So I'm sorry, I'm going to have to pound it until we actually get it. So anyway, let me start again. After that quote from Thompson, Annette has briefly mentioned the definition of stereotype. And I have the origin of the word was actually from 1798, and it was coined in a printing press scenario. And it's defined as a method of printing from a plate. So basically, it is a production of a perfect replica or an image of something. Now, this definition has evolved into a set of inaccurate, simplistic generalizations about a group that allows others to categorize them and treat them accordingly. That's from dictionary.com. But anyway, so based on that definition of stereotypes, there's two kinds. There's, overt kind of stereotype, like looking at an older person or somebody with physical disability or somebody from a different racial background. Those are the more obvious kinds of stereotypes. But we're also facing with a lot of emerging and subtle stereotypes that, our environment has evolved into using and thinking, such as, if somebody with chronic pain, for example, or somebody who complains about scent, or somebody with, the way the person dressed or the way the person talked, like we have coined a lot of labels and names to these kinds of presenting problems to like our day-to-day life. So that's what the stereotype has evolved into. It can also be positive or negative. Like, we're all familiar with the negative kind of stereotype, but are we familiar with how positive kinds of stereotypes can also negatively impact our service recipients? Like, one example would be, for example, all immigrants are hardworking, right? Like, for example, we try to use this statement, all immigrants are hardworking, and yet we are presented with a service recipient or a client who was actually there because they needed income support or they needed welfare assistance. So, so by the fact that we are reinforcing potentially positive stereotypes, it's actually negatively impacting that person, because now the fact that they're asking for help, financial help, is making them a deviant of the norm that we have stated. Another example of a positive stereotype that we need to be careful of is, oh, you're from this province. I heard people from this province are very friendly. And yet this person who's coming to us is actually presenting with a social anxiety disorder. And so by the fact that we're already saying these kinds of statements to make them feel better, or maybe make them feel like we understand who they are, we're actually making it worse, because we are already labeling that person as part of a set of group of standards that we are pointing out when we're saying these things. So those are the two things about stereotypes. Now, if I would like to go back to the anti-oppressive piece, I started doing public speaking when I had this course at Dalhousie, and it's called the Antioppressive course there. And when I started the course, I was like, yes, it's my turn. Like, of all the oppression that I've had in my whole life, look at me, visible minority woman, I should be entitled to some victim party, right? But then the reality is that the thing that changed the way I think, it changed the way I presented myself as a professional, is that I realized that although I've had experience of oppression, with the power that I have as a social worker, as a healthcare professional, I too have the power to oppress other people based on my own prejudice, based on my own bias, and based on my own set of privileges that I was not able to name until that point. So I guess the basic line that I would like to impart to all of you is that if somebody in this room, or even the ones that are listening to us right now, would say, I have no prejudice, I'm pretty, non-judgmental, non-biased, I would like for you to stop and just ask yourself again, is it true that I have absolutely no prejudice, that I have absolutely no bias of the world around me? Because these kinds of things, prejudice and stereotypes, have been, we've been socialized to have these things. Different set of stereotypes, yes, but we have been socialized. We grew up having sets of standards that, unless we start naming it, we actually won't be able to address and how it's going to impact client care. One of the formulas that we've used was that, prejudice, if you add power to your prejudice, then it's equals to oppression. I'm sure some of you have heard it. I'm sure you're familiar with it, and that's fine. But, if I may reiterate again, prejudice, as defined, is a rigid form of thinking based on stereotypes and discrimination. And again, we've all been socialized to be prejudiced at one point or another, so I would absolutely question if anybody would come and say they have no prejudice. When you add power to it, the thing about prejudice, or even having a privilege, is that we're usually not conscious about it. You know how sometimes you grew up with having, let's say, having a car here in Canada, for example, is normal. So we grew up having it, so we're oblivious to how people with no car, who can't afford to have a car, have been going through their lives without a car, because we're just expecting everybody should have a car. It's the norm. So it's the same with having, growing up with a set of privilege, with a set of prejudice and bias. It's oftentimes unconscious. So unless we actually start being reflexive in our practice and questioning ourselves, okay, I said this, was it right? Where was it coming from? Why was it that when I saw a guy with tattoo, an older guy with tattoo, and a little child with him? Why is it I always think of this could be a dirty old man who's about to abuse this child? Those are things that, my goodness, if it would catch us off guard, and whether we like it or not, it's there. The question here now is, once we are aware of our own prejudices and biases, and once we're aware that the fact that we are in the field of healthcare, whether social worker or a nurse or a dietitian, or, how does our power affect the way we serve other people? And how does our prejudice mixed with this power affect how we serve other people? I'm sure with a lot of scenarios later on, we're going to be, talking more about this aspect. Now, when you say power, it's the capacity to act in such a way as to control others. It can either be constraining or enabling. There's actually an article, I'm sure you've heard of it, to Peggy McIntosh. It's Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack, and she basically identified several items that she has taken for granted because she's from a white race, and she's from a middle class background, and it's a really good read because it brings to our consciousness how much the things that we take for granted are also the same things that we use as yardstick to judge other people. We also use those things as yardstick to gauge whether that person, how come that person has the opportunity to go to school, they just choose not to go to school, maybe because they're lazy or inadequate or whatnot. But you see, a lot of these things come into play if we don't understand where it's coming from. It's affecting how we deal with other people, and we're not understanding it. So again, like if we're also going to look at the sources or causes of this prejudice, we have what we call a Eurocentrism. This is a term that has been coined because, the early history, Europeans have a lot of power and control. And the fact that we have these isms against, older people, against people with disabilities, against women, against, people who have people who are homosexuals or LGBTQ, like all these things is actually a reflection of a particular group of people who have these biases, who in turn translates these biases into certain powers like policies or educational system, the way religion was developed and put in place. All these things became structural oppression, which in turn serves to just reiterate the biases that a certain group of people have. So from a personal group of people standards, because they have enough power to do it, it affected how the society was shaped, which in turn shaped individual norms and culture of not just that particular society, but also the places where they're actually involved in, or the place that they have influence in. So now the question back to you before I end. I'm not sure how much time I have. And if I don't have enough time, I'll make it up for later. The question that we have now is, okay, we're going to say we're just an individual healthcare group or healthcare professionals. What I need you to think at this point is that with your own individual biases, with your own individual power, you have to understand too that the fact that you have the information, that we hold the information, it means we hold a certain sense of power over people who needs those information. The question now is, if we are going to keep perpetuating, perhaps unconsciously, all the stereotypes and biases, how is it going to affect the people that we serve? And by the fact that as a healthcare group, if we are going to remain unconscious of all these stereotypes, and if we keep saying, even by joking, oh, hurry up, Grandpa, when somebody's driving slow in front of us, right? Like these things, oh, it's so funny, it's just a joke. No, it's not a joke. It's actually perpetuating these kinds of stereotypes that we are, quote, actively fighting against, right? So now the question is, it may be just an individual challenge, but how are we going to affect how we practice? How are we going to stop reinforcing these stereotypes towards the clientele group that we have? How are we going to influence our workplace? How are we going to potentially influence policies in place? And in return, when these policies are influenced, and how is it going to impact either the active opposition of these stereotypes or active perpetuation of these stereotypes? It's a vicious cycle, my friends. So I guess the challenge for all of us here is we can never be free of stereotypes. I'm answering one of your questions, but I don't think that we can ever be free of stereotypes. To fight it, that way is futile. However, we can always start asking questions the minute we meet with other people, the thoughts that we have, the things that come out of our mouth. If you have somebody that you want to consult with and, be your bouncing board just to make sure that they're going to keep you accountable, then so be it. But we need to start questioning ourselves. Why are we saying this? Why are we feeling this? Why are we doing this? And then from then on, I'm sure, with the active opposition, then so many things can be done. So anyway, I'm done with my spiel.
Thank you so much. And certainly I think George gave us a lot to think about with it. And it is something that it takes a little bit of self-reflection. One of the examples we used in the nursing world was, because of the knowledge and the gain, the labels we put on people who smoke, who make a conscious decision to smoke, or that's the way we're saying it, or their health could be impacted by it. So it may not just be your whole background, it may be some particular activity you partake in. So it's important that we put it all together and do the reflection on that in our practice. So I'm going to pass it over to Jill now.
Thank you very much. George and I are on the same page on so much of it that some of what I'm saying will be an extension of what George has just said from maybe a particular social point of view. So to begin with, I just want to flag that I am a recovering emergency room nurse. I was addicted to nursing for 25 years, and I did have my fixes in both urban and rural centers and in low resource contexts in many different countries. And it's been a challenge for me to stay away. But now as a global health coordinator, my role is really to increase the awareness of health inequities and promote health for all as part of a social justice and social accountability mandate. Social accountability is a phrase that gets used a lot in medical education these days. I'm not sure if it's found its way into the parlance of nursing education and social work so much, but in medical education it's become a very important concept. It means being responsible to the people and the communities in which we work. It also harkens to that concept of social justice in which we seek, as caregivers and as healers, to ensure that everyone is treated fairly and to the best of our abilities to ensure that there are not 2 or 3 or 4 tiers within the healthcare. I would argue that stereotypes actually operate in a very subtle and covert way to create layers, to create tiers within our healthcare system. And our healthcare system is a cultural institute. It's a cultural domain in and of itself. There is a culture of medical practice. We treat people we treat some people with depth, we treat some people with concern, and we close others off with a label that basically eclipses who they are and aspects of what they need and what they've experienced. Newfoundland is becoming a much more diversified society. And so this is a really good time for us to continue this conversation about assumptions, about stereotypes, and what they produce and what they perpetuate. As a child, I became aware of the ease with which labels and stereotypes could be created, and how they convey value, how they convey negativity, and how they convey bitterness often. I grew up in a small town in Saskatchewan. The population of the town was largely of Ukrainian origin. And it had been settled at the turn of the 20th century by stout farmers from Eastern European regions where there had been grain growing as the primary occupation. In fact, when I think about it, the community was actually a product of a stereotype because the Canadian government at the time assumed that these stout peasant farmers would be good farmers in a harsh climate and that they would develop the area for Ontario's growing economy and the fact that the railway was pushing through the prairies. So the fact that the stereotype kind of became a reality and that these peasants and these sturdy Ukrainians really did prove to be successful as farmers was probably due to fear of starvation in the harsh climate and the memory of persecution in their own countries as much as it was to anything else. The Ukrainians of the prairies were the butt of many jokes in society. They were teased for being perhaps not very intelligent, for lacking sophistication because of their accents, and for being maybe not quite socially as adept as other people. Substitute Ukrainian in any Newfoundland joke you've ever heard and you'll get the idea. I also want to tell you a story about an encounter I had when I was about 6. I went to the home of a classmate one day after school, and this girl's mother, who I'd never met before, started on a rant about a particular ethnic group. And one of the things that she said, amongst many others, was that this particular ethnic group, they all had greasy hair and dandruff. Well, I was 6, and I'm sitting there thinking, well, I know lots of, folks that look like me. Now, I'd never met anybody from this particular ethnicity that she was complaining about. But I'd met lots of folks with greasy hair and dandruff, and so I'm sitting there thinking, well, what does that have to do with anything? But at 6, I couldn't challenge her. But it stuck with me, and I remember how that image kind of gets burned into your memory as a child. Children learn to judge, and so it's very important for us to see how our prejudices, our ideas about stereotypes are formed very early on. We start with the children that we encounter, with our own children. And we have to work very hard as a society to move back. So flash forward many years, I became a nurse, and all joking aside, I had a very rich career as a nurse. I was very fortunate. And I came to realize at some point that I was probably an anthropologist. I was always asking what people call the child's game of 3 times why. But why? But why? But why? Why were people in the situation that they were in? I always wanted to understand what were the social circumstances behind the conditions in which my patients found themselves. And I refused to hold them to account completely for their health difficulties and their problems. And I think we share responsibility as caregivers to move beyond the obvious. In the news recently, there have been multiple stories on gender-based violence, from the horrific gang rape in Delhi, India, to the release of the report this week or just last week on the treatment of Aboriginal women at the hands of the RCMP here in Canada. The world's attention has been focused on this issue. What role has stereotyping played in allowing such events to continue in the 21st century? How often have rape victims been assumed to be somehow responsible for their fate? How often have nurses, doctors, social workers, and police conveyed, however subtly, the message that women should not have been where they were or doing what they were doing? The stereotype of the party girl behaving recklessly, what impact has that had? So we've perpetuated the social conditions in which this continues. What about women who are in abusive relationships? They're stereotypically portrayed as weak, foolish, submissive. When you let go of a stereotype, though, you might see, first of all, fear, but you might see tremendous strength and the capacity to strategize. Working in an emergency room in a small prairie town taught me that providing women with the resources in an appropriate place is key. Women in abusive relationships are certainly not going to pick up material on support groups in the waiting room. That doesn't make them stupid or deserving of their fate. It makes them smart. Putting those cards and pamphlets about how to get support on the backs of the bathroom doors in the women's bathroom cubicles gives them an opportunity to pick that up. That makes us smart. So when we think about how to get past the stereotype, how to get past the idea that, well, we put the information there, if they don't pick it up, that's their fault, then we become clever and we address the problem. As human beings, we crave order, social order that helps us make sense of the world. And anthropologists have studied and critiqued the way that this sort of social ordering system actually produces the people that it categorizes. In other words, the categories that we use to make sense of the world around us are actually social products. We produce them, and by doing so, we validate the world around us and perpetuate whatever is happening, whatever inequalities and issues that George talked about. So if they're man-made creations, we can unmake them. Claude Lévi-Strauss argued that the human mind and the cultural construction of order is based on the need to create binary oppositions, to create sort of opposites to help us make sense. Black and white, raw and cooked, pure and impure, those kinds of things. But post-structuralists and postmodernists, it's a scary concept for people who are social scientists, but postmodernists, of which I count myself, argue that the categories and the social order help us make sense of the world, but we need to be aware of the way that these categories and systems of order actually become laden with values and judgments and ideas about the worthiness and goodness of people. So it's not so much the fact that we create these categories. We need to make sense of the world around us. It's what values we attribute. It's how we associate particular kinds of values with those categories. The world isn't black and white, and we don't assess people. We can't assess people in this way. Life is a continuum, and we need to see how people sort of move along a continuum. If we just lived in a black and white world, what does that mean for fat and thin? What does that mean for abled and differently abled bodies, young and old? We create these binaries. We don't allow any room in between. Another concept that I'd like to flag is that of social capital. Pierre Bourdieu, for those of you who have studied social science, preeminent social scientist, sociologist, talked about how social capital operates to sustain social difference and social class. So this is a kind of stratification in our social world, and it may be invisible to many of us, but very real to others. So we develop these social skills. That becomes our social capital. And we use these social skills as a kind of currency, and we use it to navigate the social world. As caregivers, if we perceive that patients and clients, which is a word that I struggle with, if they're well educated and capable of navigating the social space in which we're seeing them, a clinic, an emergency room, wherever, hospital, is it easier to address them as an equal? If we see that people don't have that social capital, if they haven't had the education, if they haven't had the kind of upbringing that makes them comfortable in that situation, if they don't know how to navigate that situation as easily, do we see them as somehow less significant, and do we treat them differently? That's where we have to be cautious. An example that's often used of social capital is, even though things are changing somewhat, in medical schools across Canada, physicians' children are still a fairly significant proportion of the medical students who get in these days. So there's an element of social capital. They possess what it takes to achieve in that context. So, as I've argued already, it's not so much the creation of order and categories and frameworks for making sense of the world. The problem is when we use that social filing system, our creation of order, and think of it as somehow fact or nature or an objective reality. It's when we allow socially constructed ways of seeing the world to become naturalized and to be normalized. That's when we create a stratified society in which some people are treated differently than others, and where we assume that this inequality is normal, natural, and therefore justified. That's what we need to challenge. We need to prepare ourselves to accept difference with a measure of humility and humanity, and to be receptive and check ourselves for hidden assumptions and prejudices, as George said. Sometimes we're totally unaware of the way norms are created and upheld. I mean, for years, the male body was the gold standard in medicine, right? The male body was the norm. How could female bodies be anything but deviant when compared to men? I mean, we bleed, we grow boobs, we don't do anything right. So we have to think about other norms. As George pointed out, Caucasians rarely think of themselves in terms of color. We always think of ourselves as the norm to which everyone else is compared. And I also really like Peggy McIntosh's backpack. I think it's great. So stereotypes are products of the desire to create order. They're also products of our fear of the unknown, misunderstanding, and the values that get mixed up with those categories. We reaffirm for ourselves through stereotypes that we are good, that we are normal, that we are living by the standards that are established by our society. We are not them. We are not the other. The kind of normative standardization that's kept the LGBT community, mental illness and substance abuse in the dark, we're only now breaking down those barriers and categories. We create us and them. We create the other, and someone we assume is different from us and beyond our understanding and beyond our sense of compassion. We need to ask ourselves what subtle or not so subtle values and judgments accompany the labels that we attach to people we work with and encounter. This is especially challenging in medicine because diagnoses are labels. So even though labels are something that we're trying to work against, we know that in medicine we create them all the time. It's how we make sense of the patients that come to see us. Medical diagnoses convey challenges for us to deal with. But language is powerful, and the power to name something is also the power to create. And Michel Foucault described the power of discourse, powerful language that creates and objectifies, categorizes and divides what is normal from what is deviant. So I think stereotypes basically operate to flatten out individuals. They flatten out the culture, they flatten out the social circumstances and the histories of the people that we see. So how can we connect with people and have meaningful healing encounters if we don't move away from that? I was thinking, when we talked about the frequent flyer in emergency, the other term that we often use is the non-compliant patient. How often have we written that on charts? what's behind that non-compliance? Is it because the patient can't afford the drugs? Is it because they don't have a car to get to the drugstore? Is it because they don't understand what it is that we're asking them to do? Or is it because they really just don't want the side effects? You know, we often don't explore with depth. We just say, oh, they're non-compliant patient, and then that sets them up to be a failure right from the start. You know, do we assume that all substance abusers are drug-seeking? What if somebody has legitimate pain? Can a drug abuser not have an MI? Do we deny them painkillers because we know they're a drug abuser? We need to probe the depths of health needs without letting assumptions govern our history-taking. And how prepared are we to actually deal with the needs of people who are different? That's what we need to address. So if I can leave you with one message today, it's that anything we consider normal or natural should be subject to challenge. There's no singular normal or natural, and there's no singular way of being, no matter what social group, ethnicity, profession, or gender you belong to. We all inhabit many layers within a single self. Social accountability and social justice, the struggle for health equity, demand that the culture in which our medical and social services are practiced is patient and people-centered. Ethics and morality frame the need for justice and respect. Social expectations are what we are demand that we are accountable and fair. But first and foremost, we owe it to others and ourselves to treat people with dignity and humility. This means looking past stereotypes and taking the challenge to see the whole person. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jill. Another very in-depth reflection. And again, just pulling it into the whole spectrum. Another one of the pieces that we talked about, and I think Jill did a really good job of talking about how the social class and the culture that we're in, we've had our own, if you want to call it that way, again, in terms of labels. But when you as a nurse, you as a social worker, you as a physician come in and as the patient, and we can do the flip side. Oh, you know all about this, and so therefore we don't need to provide education. We don't need to support you because you know the whole system when they're a patient. And I remember a story once where a physician who was into a very high specialty turned around and said, I haven't seen anything like this in years and years, but because I had the label. So he said, explain to me, you know, exactly. Go back to me and help me understand some of the basic concepts. And it was a vital sign. But it was a reflection that they were in a totally different field. So we have to think about it from all angles. So I'll just add that little piece to it because it's a fabulous conversation. We're going to pass it off to Carrie.
Thanks. I'm just going to start with a little story about something that George mentioned about positive stereotypes. We first moved here in 2001 because of my husband's job. And when I first got here, I'm from Ontario originally, everyone assumed that I was a doctor because I'm brown. They're only new immigrants are doctors or engineers or MUN professors, yeah. And so I kept having to say, no, I'm actually a lawyer. There are brown people that are lawyers. But it was unusual for Newfoundland. But I've never, I mean, to be honest, I've never really felt that I've experienced negative implications of, you know, my whatever labels that people put on me. And I think the real reason is, and I've talked to many people about this before, I think the real reason is, you know, I'm a Canadian. I grew up here. I took Highland dancing lessons as a child. My mom is Scottish, like from Scottish origin. So I have the same sort of cultural assumptions. I know the songs. I eat the same food. I don't have, like, I dress the same, and I don't have an accent. I think that's one of the biggest things that I found in my experiences that have just led me to lead a completely normal, boring 1980s high school existence in Bowmanville, Ontario. So anyway, now I'm going to talk about the boring legal stuff. If there are instances of discrimination or harassment, usually in the workplace, then people make complaints to us at the Human Rights Commission. So the Human Rights Commission is an at-arm's length government agency which reports to the Department of Justice. We provide service to the entire province, though we're located here in St. John's. And primarily we administer the Human Rights Act by investigating and resolving complaints, usually by settlement or mediation, and by educating and informing the public about human rights law and human rights in general. Our obligation is to conduct an unbiased, thorough, and complete investigation. We're neutral. We don't represent either side. The Human Rights Act is quasi-constitutional, which means that it takes precedent over other pieces of provincial legislation where there's a conflict. The Act is applied to all departments and agencies of the Government of Newfoundland, including healthcare and school boards. It also applies to private businesses, landlords, and not-for-profit organizations. It does not apply to federally regulated businesses like Marine Atlantic or the airports. That's the Canadian Human Rights Commission. So essentially what the Act does is it prohibits discrimination or harassment in certain areas if the treatment is linked to one of the prohibited grounds. And they're the usual things that you're used to hearing: race, color, nationality, ethnic origin, social origin, religious creed, religion, age. And I'm just reading from the Act here: disability, disfigurement, sex. And even though it's not specifically stated in the Act, sex does include, by implication, transgendered. Even though it's not about sex or sexual orientation, the courts have read it into the legislation to cover people who are trans. So it does include sexual orientation, marital status, family status, source of income, and political opinion. So there has to be a link. You can't just go and say, I'm a woman, I didn't get a job, therefore I've been discriminated against. You have to show that the reason why you didn't get that job is because of something to do with you being a woman. Discrimination is defined as, and it was already, you already defined it earlier, I think, but the key in Canadian law is that it can be intentional or not. So you can make, and this is usually what happens, the cases that we see are people just are really not aware of what they need to do as far as miscommunication between different cultures or failure to accommodate people or whatever. Originally, these acts and commissions were set up in the 70s to deal with overt examples of racism. I'm just watching this series. It's an old series on PBS called Eyes on the Prize about the American Civil Rights Movement. I mean, the stuff that happened then, it happens around the world still to this day, but I'm fairly confident to say for the most part it doesn't occur in Canada anymore. And it's just shocking that that was so open and overt. Now we're dealing with much more subtle forms of discrimination based on stereotypes and assumptions. So there's different types of discrimination. There's the direct, that's what I was always talking about, the overt racism, for example. Systemic, which are stereotypical assumptions based on a person's presumed traits. This type of discrimination is subtle and much harder to prove. We need numerical data. We look at policies, practices, organizational structure, decision-making policies, all these sort of things in an organization. And they usually arise out of long-standing stereotypes about certain people. For example, I went to law school and graduated in the 90s. 50% of my graduating class were women. 5 to 6 years after graduation, probably 50 to 60% of women are out of private practice. Why is that? We have children, and we go to government, or we take jobs in-house or whatever. So the whole structure of the legal practice is not very family-friendly. An adverse effect discrimination occurs when an employer adopts for a genuine business purpose a rule which on its face is neutral but has a discriminatory effect. And for an example, I would use, a work social event, that's in a non-accessible location. I've talked to disability advocates here in town, and the rooms is not fully accessible. And during the winter, when the front path is usually, the front ramp is usually shut down because of icicles, they have to enter through the back through a service door because there's no other way to get into the building, which I was really shocked to find out about. There's a group, the COD, I think, did a really good little video that's on YouTube about accessibility of buildings. Anyway, so say if, for your instance, for your business, you have to go and, as part of client development, go to these social events to try and attract clients, say, for instance, and you can't even get into the building. And so you're right away, you're being discriminated against. So we also deal with harassment, which is defined as a course of vexatious comment or conduct that is known or ought reasonably to be known to be unwelcome. You can be harassed or discriminated by your employer, by a coworker, by, in this case, in the healthcare profession, by a patient. So it can go both ways. You can do it to them, they can do it to you. Two examples. There was a case from Ontario called Clarendon Foundation, which dealt with a number of grievances by a personal care attendant against his employer. Apparently there had been a patient that was really rude, made racist comments, and eventually refused, or basically said to the home care, I don't want to deal with this guy anymore. He was black. And the employer, instead of saying, no, you can't do that, said, sure, we'll just switch off. Today, I read in the online news, I was just doing some searches about healthcare issues. In Detroit, this month, a black nurse, there was a father who told the manager of the nurses, I don't know how it was structured, said, I don't want any black nurses looking after my baby. And they put that on the file, no African-American nurses, and she found out about this. So that's going on, where instead the employer should have said, no, forget you, that's not how we work here. So she eventually is suing the employer, so I don't know what's happening there. Anyway, it's interesting. We also have another case. Basically what stands, normally the case law says that employers can't sanction, like I was saying, patients' discriminatory requests. But we have one case that was from Newfoundland about a personal care home, not a personal care home, but a personal care assistant. And the gentleman who received these services, the woman that he had hired originally went off on maternity leave. So when she went off on maternity leave, you know how your job is held kind of for you when you're off on maternity leave. When she came back, he said, no, I don't like you. I don't want you anymore. I want this other woman who's been filling in for me. And the judges agreed and said, you can do that as long as it's not for a discriminatory reason. You're allowed to have personal preferences and who cares for you. And I think the difference was because it was personal care, he was older, he needed specific, like very personal things done. And the other thing the judge said, well, this other older woman cooks the traditional Newfoundland food that he really likes. So this was actually in the court case. So that wasn't a great case for us, but it just goes to show you that these things can happen. Okay, so the Human Rights Act only applies to certain areas: the provision of goods and services, which includes healthcare, accommodations, that's tenancy, employment, publications, and the making of contracts. Now, most of our complaints have to do with employment. I'm primarily an employment law lawyer. And most of our employment law complaints have to do with the failure of an employer to accommodate an employee's physical or mental disability. So, in fact, the accommodation of mental disabilities, including invisible disabilities like chronic pain or depression or something like that, those our statistics keep going up and up in that area. So Section 25 of the Human Rights Act deals with the intake of complaints. We can only accept complaints if there are reasonable grounds for believing that a person has contravened the Human Rights Act. It's a relatively low threshold to get a complaint in our office, in through the door of our office, and that's really in keeping with the original intent of the legislation, that is providing, an opportunity or access to justice for people who believe they've been discriminated against. But just because they're accepted at the initial intake stage doesn't necessarily mean that discrimination has been found. It's a complaint process, and there's an investigation process, and there's many opportunities throughout that process for complaints to be dismissed or to be resolved or mediated or whatever. The government of Newfoundland, including school boards and healthcare boards, is the largest respondent, I guess, that we have. Meaning they have the most complaints against them. And I don't know whether that's a result of the fact that the government is, up until yesterday, one of the largest employers in the province, or if, government employees are heavily unionized, they might avail of, sessions like this today to know of their rights and to know that this commission exists so that they can file complaints. They have respectful workplace programs, all these sorts of things. But I've traveled around the province, and smaller businesses, like I've had honestly people say, what do you mean I can't fire somebody who's pregnant? We have so many complaints where women who, as soon as they disclose that they're pregnant, their contract is over or they get terminated. So this happens still. Okay, so as I was talking about undue accommodation and undue hardship earlier, the law requires that employers and service providers accommodate people to the point of undue hardship. And that's a legal construct, but it implies a duty which requires significant difficulty or expense. Most of the times, they're very simple, they're very easy. It's a computer program that increases the font on your computer, or a desk that rises up and down if you sit at a desk, or a special chair, or these things. It's very rare that you have to go and, spend $1 million to adapt your building to allow people to get in and out. It's a multi-party process. That means unions also have a duty to participate, and they can be held liable if they just block it for an accommodation for, say, seniority reasons. The employees also have to provide certain information to support the need for accommodation and to accept reasonable accommodations if they're offered. So that means you don't have to disclose, your diagnosis, but you have to be able to tell your employer, I need XYZ because I can't lift 10 pounds, or I need to, work part-time, or do whatever. You have to be able to show with medical evidence your functional limitations. And just to provide a note from your doctor saying, off sick for medical reasons doesn't really cut it anymore. So, and the employer, their responsibility is to have a policy in place to take the request seriously and get expert evidence if necessary. We had a case a few years ago where a woman who had, I can't remember, hepatitis A or B, was working at or was studying at a school for estheticians. And when she got accepted, and when she disclosed that she had whichever, hepatitis A or B, the school kicked her out. And basically what they said is, you're going to be doing practice nails and all these sorts of things, facials and whatever, on other students. And because of the type of disease you have or illness that you have, we were fearful, or they were fearful, that there would be a risk of spreading it. But in this case, we won this one, thankfully, but basically the adjudicator said they had the opportunity and should have, it's very simple to find out the proper medical evidence that really, with gloves and proper sanitization and maybe not having people doing certain procedures on this woman, that you could certainly have kept her in this school. She could have graduated and could have gone on to a very successful career as an esthetician. But sometimes people hear hepatitis B, HIV, all these things, and all of a sudden these little flashes or sensors go up that there's a problem. So our process is fairly simple. We have a 1-year limitation period. People call our office or email our office and speak to one of our investigators. Does it fit within the confines of the Human Rights Act? Do we file can we draft and file a complaint form? Then it gets served on the respondent. It's like a legal process, like a statement of claim and a defense. It starts a legal process, which sometimes can end up at the Supreme Court of Canada. We've had cases like that. The legal document is served on the respondent. They get an opportunity to respond. Documents are disclosed. Interviews are done. Work sites are sometimes visited. And a report is drafted. People are given the opportunity to respond, and they make comments on all these submissions. And then finally, after the report is drafted and we've got all this information, these reports go to the commission for a review. And our commission is also like our board of directors. And they're just basically people appointed from across the province, and they decide whether or not there's enough evidence there to warrant a board of inquiry. And a board of inquiry is like a hearing, like a court hearing. And what they're supposed to do is represent community standards and community norms. There's only a few lawyers on them. Most of them are teachers, professionals, nurses, social workers, people from whatever field. And they're just supposed to say, does this sound like there's enough evidence of discrimination to warrant a hearing? If there is, it goes to a board, and the witnesses are called, testimony is sworn, and a decision is rendered. So it can get quite complicated. Initially, these commissions were set up, these adjudicative tribunals were set up like the labor board to provide inexpensive, simplified process to resolve matters. Unfortunately, once lawyers get involved, they're no longer simplified, and these things can take years. We have some complaints that have had preliminary, interlocutory applications on how much medical information should be disclosed, and so it can drag on for a long time. We're really trying to focus, though, more on early settlement and mediation, and the mediations that we have had have been very successful. So my thoughts is that public education is what's really important, and if people do make complaints, then you get to them as soon as you can, try and mediate it, resolve it, and send the parties on their way, because the more protracted a legal dispute is, you'll never be able to go back to work at your old workplace if you've been in a legal harangue for like the past 3 or 4 years. Anyway. And that's about it for right now.
Okay. Thank you. And there's been a lot of references and resources that have been cited here today, so we'll see what we can do with the panel people to get you that information. So now what we're going to do is go into some of the cases where we're actually going to help apply some of the information into practice and get the panel's reflections on it. So I'm going to pass it over to Annette.
And thank you again, George, Jill, and Carrie. A lot of great information to reflect on, right from the personal to the professional to the human rights aspect of what we're asking people to reflect on. So thank you. So we're going to switch gears and present a couple of cases, and they're really meant to stimulate some further reflection, some further thought. And so I'm just going to talk about the first one, and each of the panelists will then have an opportunity to respond as well. So you are a healthcare professional working in emergency. John, a 72-year-old gentleman, has presented at emergency for the 6th time this month. John has a history of substance abuse, primarily narcotics. Recently, John was diagnosed with dementia, but to date, he is refusing any services. During his latest visit, John's partner Peter came along and was hoping to get information about a placement into long-term care for both him and John. So in terms of some points, questions that the panelists were asked to consider, were what are some of the possible stereotypes, assumptions that may impact on John's care in this particular case? And how do we recognize when the personal is having an impact on the professional? And what about our own comfort levels in working with the client? And as a society, do we hold paternalistic attitudes towards seniors? Or what kind of attitudes do we hold? What about seniors with dementia and so forth? Are there any legal or human rights issues that we might need to consider? And are there resources that may assist us as healthcare professionals in our work? And how do we effectively challenge any of the societal stereotypes or prejudices that might be in our workplaces or communities? So we're going to start with Jill to provide us with her comments and thoughts on this particular case.
Thank you very much. I guess as a recovering emerge nurse, I probably have seen people like John in the past. One of the first things that came to mind, well, first of all, he's presented and emerged 6 times in a month. So obviously there's some challenges there, and there needs to be some questions. And so, we can talk about that frequent flyer label that might diminish his actual health needs, but it doesn't reduce the need to care for him and to provide a deeper level of service. But I was intrigued, first of all, by the history of substance abuse and the primarily narcotics. The first stereotype or assumption that might come to mind if you see that on the chart, particularly in the emergency room, of a frequent flyer is this guy drug seeking? Is he in need of drugs? And what kind of, what's the origin of this addiction? There's many reasons why people become addicted to substances, and sometimes they're people who are business people, they're professional people, they're university professors, who knows, anybody, any walk of life. You can have a car accident, you can have chronic pain, and you can become addicted to substances, and when suddenly your prescriptions are no longer available to you, you don't have much recourse but to perhaps look for those narcotics somewhere else. And we don't always provide support, especially for the elderly. We don't think about somebody like John as needing to go to a halfway house or a rehab center to get treatment. So we close off a lot of times the opportunity to think about the depth of this person's problem as a substance abuser. The other thing that might come out of this is that we might consider if he's been using narcotics, perhaps he's got something like HIV or Hep C, and that raises a lot of flags about putting people in long-term care. So we need to think about whether or not we're going to, in some subtle way, be conveying that John here is a risk to other people, that somehow he's a vector of a disease as opposed to a victim of a disease. And that often happens with diseases like Hep B and HIV. We don't think about the patient, we think about the risk they pose to others, and that really shuts down our ability to deal with them as human beings. Another thing that I thought we might consider with John is, Peter is his partner. That suggests that he's in a homosexual relationship, but that doesn't mean he doesn't have other family. There are lots and lots of people in homosexual relationships who were in heterosexual relationships in the past who might have children. And maybe there's children out there that we should be contacting, and we shouldn't assume that he has no one else, that Peter is his only resource. And so we should be asking, what other family do you have? Do you have children? Are there people that we could call on? That assumption about what the family looks like or what a couple looks like sometimes blocks us. And there was a poll on CBC. I'm not sure how many of you heard that last week. They do those polls in the morning on CBC, and they ask you to comment. And one of the poll last week was about a lesbian couple who are going to adopt a child. And, do we think this is a good idea? Well, why do we even ask that question? I actually was quite horrified that CBC would have that as a poll. It suggests somehow that this isn't normal. So, as I said, challenge the norms. They're a family. Why not? Why shouldn't they adopt? What's the big deal? So we need to think about John and his partner as a family, and we need to broaden our horizons about what that might mean for him as a family, as a member of a family. In terms of resources in society, I don't think there's very many long-term care facilities that address the needs of the LGBT community. I think it's a real challenge. In fact, there was a film made recently that addressed the fact that gay men are actually going back in the closet when they go into long-term care because they are discriminated against, persecuted. So after years, this generation, guys like John, who are 72, were the generation that worked really hard to promote gay rights, to get acceptance and to have gay marriage recognized in society. And now, when they go into long-term care, when they really need support in their partners, they're going back in the closet because that's not accepted. And so long-term care is a place where we really need to do a lot of work to address the needs of people in that community. There's a few long-term care homes out there that call themselves rainbow or LGBT friendly, but not very many. And I don't know that I'm not sure there's any in St. John's. I don't know, George, you might know a little bit about that. But it's something that we really do need to consider. So those were the things that kind of jumped out at me. In terms of professionals, those are the stereotypes we need to think about. We need to think about addressing what it means for an elderly gay man. We need to think about what it means for an elderly man with a substance abuse problem. Those are the issues that are probably front and center from my perspective. So thanks.
Thank you, Jill. Certainly some different things and things for us to consider when we have clients or patients that present in those kinds of situations, and more about opening the space for the dialogue to continue, to get past what the assumptions might be and to really figure out what the story is and what the lived experience is of that particular couple, family, or patient or client. Okay, moving right along now to Carrie.
Okay, thanks. I did a little bit of research in this area because I'm not in the healthcare field. I looked primarily at some reports that the Ontario Human Rights Commission have done on aging, mental health, and visible minorities in the healthcare profession, so I'm just going to cite them up front. With respect to age, Jill has already talked about some of these things, but people in these reports describing treated as if they were less intelligent, less capable of making decisions on their own. They were talked to in a patronizing way and left out of treatment decisions involving their medical care, even when they were capable of being involved. And there was some concern about side effects that were not taken into account for certain people, especially, with dementia or Alzheimer or something like that. There were stories from people about physicians who normalized concerns of older people, saying, oh, that's just, you're getting old, these things happen. Often relating, like I said, them to the aging process, and in turn providing inadequate assessment and follow-up care. There was also some concern expressed about the use of, or the high rate of use of antipsychotic drugs in long-term care facilities. I've got a friend whose father is, working his way through the healthcare system, and though he's received excellent care, she thinks that they're putting him on a lot of drugs, and to keep him calm and to keep him quiet, and who knows if that's necessarily 100% medically necessary. With respect to substance abuse, there's lots of stereotypes there about people not able to accurately assess situations. They can't make decisions about their own lives because of substance abuse. And the physical condition of dementia tied in with substance abuse or any other physical conditions or illnesses are not taken as seriously. With respect to the LGBT issue, some, especially older men, may find it harder to disclose their sexual orientation because, they feel like it's not an inclusive environment, the healthcare field, or a long-term care setting like Jill was talking about. So they may refuse care or not seek out care because they feel stigmatized. They're dealing with healthcare professionals who don't accept the relationship for whatever reasons or don't know how to deal with it. Healthcare professionals must recognize and respect the validity of the same-sex relationship, regardless of their own personal feelings about this topic. There was a case a couple of years ago I read about in the news. I don't ever know how it was resolved, but it was coming out of the Manitoba, I believe, Human Rights Commission. And essentially what happened was in a rural community, a recent immigrant physician who was Muslim, a woman, refused to treat a lesbian couple that were coming into the clinic. And so they filed a complaint against the healthcare clinic and the doctor, and I don't know what happened, but in that case, I would argue that they would not be able to refuse treatment. This is a public service, regardless if it was a private service. It's a service that's customarily offered to the public, and therefore should operate in a non-discriminatory fashion. Also, I've heard of cases where, say for instance, there was one in Ontario where a surgeon refused to treat, as part of the transition phase, do a surgery on a trans woman, a person transitioning to becoming a woman. In that case, the physician was not found liable because it was determined that the surgery that the patient was requested was outside of this doctor's sphere of practice. He would have had to go back and done extra training and done all this sort of stuff to be able to complete this specific type of surgery. So for those reasons, it was found not to be discriminatory. Also, Peter may not be treated as a legitimate family member. Okay, sorry. Jill had talked about, maybe there are other family members out there, but you've got to, avoid the instance where the gay partner is not considered family and not included in the decision-making process, or not even allowed to visit. I mean, I read in some of these reports about, family only being allowed to visit. I know now, I had a friend who was on the maternity ward, and when they had the flu bug going around, they said, family only, but you can also designate certain family friends, or however they phrase it. So I think there's some acknowledgement there that a family is, bigger than just your immediate family. With respect to some legal or human rights concern, since 2004, Newfoundland has recognized same-sex marriage. So if John and Peter are legally married and John becomes incompetent and there is no advanced healthcare directive, Peter could act as substitute decision maker as a spouse, a legal spouse. And he would trump other family members if they showed up because there's a category, spouse, children, parents, siblings. However, if they're a common law relationship, usually, which is defined as, living together in a married relationship for more than 2 years, he would be like any other common law spouse, and there was no advanced health care directive. They would not be considered the substitute decision maker if there were other family members. Okay, I'll be really quick.
Oh, you still got lots of time.
I
Carrie?
was given the 2-minute warning. I guess I'll just end for this. Two quick points. I read in one of the studies about gay couples that they really feared going into long-term care facilities, either because the relationship wouldn't be considered valid or respected, or that they might even get split up because there was no, thought, guess, put on the fact that these people had spent their lives together and they should be able to grow old together in the long-term care facility. And the other last thing, there was some mention about John refusing services. So just because, you have the right to refuse treatment if you want to, and you can determine what should be done with your own body. There was some stories in the report on aging about older people being coerced into taking medication so that they could leave the hospital. I'm not letting you out until you, show me that you're taking these medicines, like non-compliant patients. So that's certainly something to be concerned about. And I will wrap up there. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Carrie. When I heard you speak, a lot of terms just jumped in my mind around ageism, paternalism, capacity, rights, and so forth. And that's basically what we've been talking about. And the point around the advanced healthcare directives, I think, was key as well, in terms of, as healthcare professionals, we can be telling people at any stage about the importance of advanced healthcare directives, because a lot of people don't know that they have to actually have an advanced healthcare completed to say who do you want to speak on their behalf if the need be. So people, the importance of filling those out and having those on file. The piece around capacity is so important too, that you talked about, in terms of, does John even want any intervention? And just because he has a diagnosis of dementia, we know that a diagnosis of dementia doesn't equal a person not being able to make their own decisions, and there's, of course, a varying degree of dementia. And I read recently a report from the Alzheimer's Society of Canada. The social worker with them was talking about the stigma of dementia, and how clients who had dementia felt that they were being stigmatized just because they had that diagnosis of dementia, and what that meant to them in terms of their family, community support, and so forth. So thanks again, and now we'll pass it on to George.
I was about to say, if Jill is a recovering nurse, emerged practitioner, I'm a recovering ageist. Because I remember when I was starting school, I said to myself, I'm never going to be able to work with older people because they're old, they're dying, they don't need any intervention. I need to be more involved in highly complex care. And look where I am working. Look what I want to champion at this point. Because really, it's such a lie that, I'm hopefully recovering from. But anyway, let's look at the facts of the case. It's a healthcare emergency scenario. There's this John, 72 years old, 6 times in 1 month, refused services, history of narcotic abuse, has dementia, and has same-sex partner, Peter. Some of the stereotypes and assumptions, just by looking at this scenario, that jump at me, that could be in your minds as well, is number one. You mentioned frequent flyer. I would ask, does this person have paranoia to be wanting to be in the hospital so many times? My time is being wasted with, the same person coming over and over again. Are the concerns legitimate? Oh, because of the narcotic abuse history, does he just want more, free drugs? And the fact that he's refusing services is being difficult, agitated. What is the term that you're using? Non-compliant, behavioral problems. He's refusing to do what I, as a healthcare professional, tells him to do. My goodness, this person has a problem, right? And then some of the things that also jump at me, okay, this person has dementia. Do I even have to talk to this person? Maybe he wouldn't understand what I'm going to say. Just the fact that somebody has a diagnosis of dementia, it's so easy to look beyond that person, look at the next of kin who has the power of attorney, and not even bother to check if this person can even understand what's going on, right? So the other thing is the fact that he is sorry, not that he's bisexual or homosexual. So, okay, the image of dirty old man jumps at me again. Or, does this person have HIV? If he was using needles before, would he have this, right now? Or, does Peter have the right to decide, which, has been explored too by Jill and Carrie. The other thing is if he's going to long-term care, if Peter wants him to go to long-term care is not even prepared to deal with sexual advances from older people who said they were sexual. Like, I've had experiences where a husband would actually wants to have physical contact with his wife and have the wife on his lap. And I've heard comments saying, my goodness, look at that's horrible. These people have been married for so many years. Wanting to touch each other is as common as night and day. And instead of just drawing the curtain, you would be saying, that's horrible, maybe we need to use some patch, to curb the hormones. I mean, we're not prepared to deal with sexuality, between among older people in long-term care. How much more are we prepared to deal with homosexuality, same-sex partners in a long-term care setting? That's a big question in my mind. And then the other things that also came to my mind was, okay, he's a junkie. Or demented. I've heard the word demented before to describe people with dementia, and I thought my blood pressure would just go to the roof. Demented, as defined, refers to people who are insane, who are daft, who are crazy, loco. People with dementia, depending on the stage of dementia that you are in, depending on the level of recognition that you have, may not necessarily always display aggressive behavior or insane behavior. And for us to label people with dementia as demented, I'm sorry, but it really... Anyway, it makes me white. I'm sorry. So anyway, the other question, so we have, if you want to, raise your hand if, 2 minutes, raise your hand if you feel that I've missed any of the stereotypical thoughts that, we would attach to this case. But what is the impact of the personal and professional? We also have to understand emergency scenario. For example, as healthcare professionals, we're not perfect. You're probably, burning 2 candles, being so tired, and then have to present with this situation could make a short fuse shorter. So what are the things that we can do about it? Like, for example, if you're feeling hesitation or reluctant to address the situation, you feel discomfort, you can stop and pause and identify it and name it. Ask somebody else to come with you if you need to. And when you're dealing with a person, instead of, you are aware of all these biases in your head, now the next thing that we need to do now is, okay, I have very limited experience with this situation. I may not know a lot of information, but I'm going to find out for you. Just the fact that we're going to be open and telling them, this is not my comfort zone, but I'm going to do what I can to assist you with whichever way possible. That is opening a whole lot of communication that is otherwise blocked if we're not careful. So that, that is one of the things that I would like to recommend. Be truthful. Try to avoid labeling, still be respectful. And instead of assuming, that the person with dementia cannot address the situation, start by talking to the person himself. Establish that assessment that you can do while talking to the person. And then the power of attorney and next of kin was already discussed. And I think one of a really good resource was the one in NLAW. They had a paper drafted about competence and capacity. And I find it very interesting because you actually identify that capacity is in a spectrum form. It's not no capacity, yes capacity, no. Depending on what decision-making skills is needed, you can be capable of making decisions about your clothes, but not capable about your finances. And I think it's a really good resource, which later on we're going to share with you. So that's my thoughts for now.
And thank you again, George. Certainly a lot of good themes coming through from what each of you were talking about around the reflective piece. So reflecting on what we would consider some of our own biases, some of our own stereotypes or perceptions. And George, I like your honesty at the beginning, how you're recovering ageist. I know you've written about some of that before as well. And in being in tune in terms of what some of the labels are and what they might mean and how that actually can help or create the cultures in which we're working in terms of some of the stereotyping that exists. And the strategies that you talked about were really key in terms of how do we open up the communication and starting with the person first, which is key in terms of getting past all the stereotypes. In this case would be to start with John and what John's particular needs are. So it was a really good discussion, and thank you, George, Jill, and Carrie. I'll now pass things over to Lynn again for the second case.
Okay, we're building a little bit on this, so there won't be, again, as much story, but we want them to dig into a different types of scenario. So this one, we're just going to be you, where you are, your background. You're a social worker working in the community. You're a nurse working in acute care. You're a physiotherapist working in an outpatient clinic, or you're a therapist of some sort working in private practice. So just be you, who you are. And these are the client profiles that are coming across your day. And just as a panel, we're just going to ask them some of the things. What do you think about? What challenge do you face as in these capacities? So the first one we're going to talk about is body image. So a 19-year-old underweight female comes in. So she's 19 years old, she's underweight. Where do you think? What are you thinking about? Then if she's come in with a history of overdosing. Oh, the fire alarm system is now back in service. So for those out there in St. Anthony, I'm sure you care a lot, but we're doing well here in the city. So back on the body image. So we want you to think about the 19-year-old who's underweight and what you may think about. The 30-year-old woman who weighs over 350 pounds and is seeking recreation funding for her 10-year-old daughter. Right? What are you thinking? Prominence. A client who's a 33-year-old male comes in to see you, and he's an inmate of the local correctional facility. What do you think? A 45-year-old prominent politician in the community crosses your desk. So prominence, how are you looking at things? Manner of dress. A 28-year-old woman who presents to the emergency room with a child with a broken arm. And she's dressed impeccably, or she's dressed in what you may label shabby. What do you think? The 16-year-old who's dressed in the goth. Where do you think? Culture. A 25-year-old female of Aboriginal descent who crosses your path. A 45-year-old male who doesn't speak English and appears agitated and upset. Different types of scenarios we're going to present in, and they'll touch on a few. They obviously won't have time to touch on them all, but they'll make a few comments about some of these things that we can think about. So starting this particular case off, Carrie is going to start us off.
Okay, thanks. I was going through all these studies and, the cases, and some of them, like, say, body image or prominence in the society, those aren't necessarily prohibited grounds like I was talking about earlier. Though the one here about the overweight woman, that has been in the courts determined to be sometimes a perceived disability, and you can have cases based on that. But no, they're not technically human rights matters, though they are about stereotypes and assumptions, clearly. Criminal conviction in our Act is only with respect to employment. So you can't be denied employment because you have a previous criminal conviction, but only with employment. Social status is not a prohibited ground. So I feel that a lot of discrimination that occurs is about class or education or these sorts of bigger issues rather than, the color of your skin or this or that or whatever. But that's not a prohibited ground in our Act. Source of income is a prohibited ground, but that is strictly defined in the Act as to being in receipt of social assistance. So the reason why it was put in there was to say if you're denied rental accommodation, it's because you're on social assistance. Manner of dress is not specifically a human rights matter in our Act, unless the dress is a reflection of one of the prohibited grounds, for example, cultural or religious or something like that. One of these reports that I read, there was a study from St. John's, which I found very interesting, from 2008 about immigrant Muslim women claiming that healthcare professionals' lack of knowledge and discriminatory attitudes resulted in insensitive, inappropriate care. These women reported instances of healthcare providers becoming frustrated or angry when asked to acknowledge or respect religious or cultural benefits and needs. Example, the preference for female healthcare providers, the need for privacy and for remaining clothed during some assessments. Some were subjected to insults and stereotypes that left them feeling embarrassed and ashamed. Healthcare providers would have a duty to accommodate to the point of undue hardship in these instances. So, for example, if somebody said, I prefer to see a female doctor, I can only speak for myself, but I would prefer to see a female doctor for female issues. There may be a duty on the healthcare board to accommodate those legitimate requests if they're related to a legitimate religious or cultural need. However, that's obviously balanced against, the ability of them to even provide that service. There may not be any female doctors available in that particular rural location, say, for instance, or it just wouldn't be financially possible to provide, your choice of doctor for every person. But it's certainly something that that would need to be worked out. These are not new issues. They've been dealt with across the country, across the world, this issue of accommodation. So the answers are out there. You just sometimes, like George said, stop, say, I'm not really sure what to do in this situation. I'm going to find out further information. I think that really works well in most situations. For a healthcare provider, I think to simply say, forget it, you get whatever doctor is on duty is not sufficient anymore. There are other religious and cultural things that need to be dealt with. Another stereotype about manner of dress is, say, if you're wearing a headscarf, a hijab. You might assume that that person is from an oppressed culture where their husband is calling the shots. I don't know. That's just something that comes to mind. I mean, you're not used to seeing people. I'm sure you've now seen the St. John's city is changing as a city, right, over the past number of years. I mean, I've seen people walking around in the full head-to-toe niqab, is that what it's called, with just the eye slit. So, I mean, that's really something different for us here. How do you deal with women that come in like that and need appropriate care? The Aboriginal woman brought in by the police, there's many studies that show that there are assumptions about Aboriginal people and culture shape the patient-provider encounters and quality of care. Stereotypes exist that violence and substance abuse is an inherent attribute of Aboriginal culture, therefore a causal factor in illness, which can result in a patient's concerns being dismissed, misdiagnosed, denial of care, poor relationship, which results in a reluctance to access health services due to a fear of stigmatization and mistreatment. A non-English speaker who appears upset. This Ontario report about new immigrants in healthcare said that there were many instances where primarily like family doctors, healthcare providers, refused to take new immigrants as patients. I've even heard about them refusing to take older people as patients. Because they feel that, because of the language problem, that there would be more problematic or time-consuming patients. Also, another thing to consider is the deterioration of, your English skills when you're under stress. My husband is from Colombia, and I win every argument because as soon as we start to fight, he can't speak English, even though he's perfectly fluent in English. But his thoughts get all jumbled up and he can't, so I'm like, I win all the time. So, I mean, these are certainly things that you need to be aware of. Sometimes it's just as simple as spending a little bit of extra time with that patient to try and work out the problems. I mean, I remember when I was pregnant with my both my kids, I had a great obstetrician. He was wonderful, but I mean, 2 minutes I was in there. And he was backing out the door as I was saying, excuse me, can I have 1 more minute? And here I am, like a well-educated person. My husband is a physician. I had all these resources available to me. And like, you just don't have the time because you're too busy. But sometimes just a little bit of extra time to talk to a person really makes a difference. Another thing that I thought was really interesting in these reports was the fact, little simple things like asking a person, how do you pronounce your last name? My last name is Majid. No, it's not a very common Newfoundland name. All you have to do is ask me, right? That, I think, is a lot better than, not naming the person or just refusing to even talk about, mention it, Miss, Mrs., whatever, rather than trying. Even if you mangle it, at least you're trying. There was one interviewee said that hospital staff had decided to change her name using an anglicized form instead of her own name. I only thought that happened at like Ellis Island in the 1800s, but I guess, it still happens in some settings today. The other thing, the last point that I'll make is the lack of just general cultural awareness about different cultures. The Association of New Canadians does really good presentations on this kind of cross-cultural understanding, and I found them very informative. I think I'm kind of, I'm multicultural. I'm married to a Spanish person. My father's from the West Indies. I grew up in Canada, but I mean, even I'm still not aware of all the different things that come into play when different cultures are involved. It may lead to improper care for refugees from war-torn countries, or for example. My kids, at Christmas time for school, they had to do up these little boxes for different charities that they send overseas. And in it, I never realized, but I mean, obviously, I wouldn't have sent something like a little war toy in any event, but they had to specifically say on the instructions, do not send guns or anything related to war or soldiers or whatever. And I mean, it made me kind of think, because we're so sheltered here, and my son is playing, Star Wars and this and that all the time, but you don't realize the impact that might have on people in different countries. And one other example that I'll take from this report, a doctor's lack of knowledge about a patient's culture led to an instance where the patient stopped taking important blood pressure medication during a religious fast and ended up in the ER. So simple things like during Ramadan, Muslim people fast, so you need to be aware of the impact that might have on medication, as simple as that.
Interesting, for sure. Jill, your thoughts?
George, do you want to go next? Because you were last time. So.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Play bunch.
All right, thank you. A lot of what Carrie said is really resonates, I think, with what goes on here at the medical school in terms of trying to educate the physicians of tomorrow about the importance of culture and stereotypes and meeting the needs of a very diverse population. If we start with body image, there's a lot of work been done. In fact, there's a nurse in the Faculty of Nursing, Pam Ward, I don't know how many of you know her, recently got her PhD, who does a lot of work on body image and obesity and what's called the obesity panic, and the way that obesity as a health problem has now been sort of framed. It draws on all those social values that I was speaking about earlier. So we now imbue this notion of a health issue with ethical and moral and social implications. It's bad to be obese, and there must be something really negative about the way you live. And so there's a lot of work being done. We need to work on health as the fundamental concept. And so the fact that we have perhaps in this one case a 19-year-old underweight who's overdosed, obviously an unhappy, mentally ill young woman, she's underweight, and then we have a woman who's overweight and wants to get funding for her child to be involved in some kind of sports or recreation activities. So we have someone who's actually taking some very positive steps for their child to promote health. And so chances are that 350-pound woman might be actually held to account for not only her own weight, but the weight of her child. Instead, we should be congratulating an initiative to promote health and well-being. There's no reason to assume that, first of all, the woman and her daughter are unhealthy. We should be assuming that they're making steps to improve their health and not hold them to account on some level. It's those kinds of assumptions that are really problematic. It's quite possible that the underweight female is not anorexic, as might be conveyed by the case, but maybe just not eating because she's depressed. There's many reasons why this could be happening, and so it's really important to explore all of those possibilities. When it comes to the issue of prominence, the 33-year-old male who's an inmate in the local correctional facility, we know about the social determinants of health, right? We know about things like gender, socioeconomic status, educational status, employment, social networks, all those things that contribute to our well-being, safety, housing. All those things contribute to health. But those same things contribute to criminal behavior. So they're the social determinants of health are also the social determinants of our actions within the community. So young men, a 35 or a 33-year-old man who's in a correctional facility, chances are he didn't have safe housing, he didn't have a good education, he didn't have a good social network. So all the same things that would have contributed to poor health for this young man have also contributed to his place his lack of prominence, the fact that he's in this correctional facility. So if we turn this around and say, well, he's not a criminal, he's an unhealthy young man who's had some really negative things happening in his life, we can see him in a much different light, and we might approach his health problems in a different way as well. The 45-year-old male with, is a prominent politician. Well, there again, the social capital. We might assume that, gee, he's riding high. Everything's great with him. Maybe he's got a little health issue. We deal with him in a very cursory way. Perhaps we don't explore in any depth what his issues are either, because we assume that he will bring to us all of the concerns that he has. We don't have to probe, that he knows how to deal with things. But maybe we're going to miss something if we don't actually ask all the questions and do a good history. And so making assumptions about the social capital that this man brings and missing the opportunity to explore very thoroughly what his issues are is also a problem. Manner of dress. I think Carrie did a great job of talking about the ethnicity piece and the fact that we might make judgments about the household dynamics based on what women wear when they come into the emergency room. I'm not sure how many of you have had this experience, but I raised 3 active boys who made rare visits to the emergency room, but occasionally presented with something that looked like I only had one with a broken bone, I guess, but we're sitting in the emergency room and the nurse comes in with the form to check off about all the risk for abuse, that's the normal thing, and my son is climbing up the wall and around the blood pressure cuff and down, and she said, yeah, okay, I can see how that would happen. But it's when you start making assumptions about the capacity of an individual to care for their child based on what they're wearing that we really run into trouble. So someone who's not dressed particularly well. I'm thinking about that case in Toronto this weekend where the young woman gave birth on the sidewalk, walking to the hospital in the Jane and Finch area, which is not a particularly wealthy area. She arrives in the hospital, they make an attempt to resuscitate this baby and then decide the baby's dead, put it on a gurney and put a sheet over it, and the child survived. The policeman noticed that the child was breathing. What stereotypes do you think might have contributed to that situation? If you're just thinking about what the woman looked like, what kind of social capital she presented with, I think that's probably a situation where stereotypes played a big role in how that child was treated. I guess mom and baby are doing quite well now, but that was the first thing I thought of was, oh my, I wonder what they were thinking. Same with Aboriginal women. There's an overwhelming assumption that Aboriginal women, especially young women, that come into the emergency room are perhaps drug seekers and that they're probably in the sex trade. And that there was a case in Saskatchewan in 1995 in which a woman was picked up by 2 university students. In fact, one hid in the trunk of the car so that the Aboriginal woman would get in the car because she knew she knew enough not to get in the car with 2 men. They beat her to death. And it turned out at the trial, the judge actually said, well, we have to take into account she was a prostitute. Well, it turned out, in fact, when her family were interviewed, she was a mother, she was a daughter, she was a sister, she was a pillar of her community, she was very supportive of other people in her community. She decided that 2 nights a month, she would turn tricks in order to gain a little bit of extra money. She was really strapped for cash on social services, so she decided 2 nights a month she could do this just to get a bit of extra cash. So the assumption that, we know what's going on with those women is really, I think, dangerous. So anyway, I'll wrap it up. Thanks.
Okay. George, your thoughts?
I have a lot of thoughts. We don't have a lot of time, but all these examples that we have in terms of, body image, prominence, manner of dressing, culture, it may be different scenarios, but it all boils down to one thing. These are the sense of otherness that we have created because they don't fit the mold. So we can exhaust a lot of potential examples where we have stereotypes, and the list could be endless. But the fact is that we have this towards them because they don't fit the mold that we have set for ourselves, or that how we're socialized to view these people or them. Some people get upset with these people. But anyway, the thing that I want to focus on is, Carrie and Jill has focused on a lot of the stereotypes and what potential realities they have compared to what we have in our minds. But I would like to focus on is that, to emphasize that whichever situation we face, number one, we need to start where the client is. You know, it's okay to have these stereotypes in our heads. We're not going to be rid of them fully because it's always going to be there. We see it in the media. You know, we see it on TV. We watch it. We read it in newspapers. We read it in books. We read it in fictions. But what we need to do is start where the client is. Start asking questions. So, you know, how can I help you? You know, why were you here? What are the services that you needed? Is there any information that you would like to have? By asking these non-leading questions, we are letting the person determine what her reality is or what his reality is, what their perceptions are. One of the quotes, again, that I really like is that we have to be careful not to let our professional desire and obligation, you know, to help, to override a person's right to self-determination. Sometimes we feel that as professionals, we're here to help. We're here to help these people or them make the right decision, the best decision. But sometimes in this desire to help, we are overriding that person's capacity or right to determine for themselves what they should or should not have. So that's the basic thing that I would like to share with you. And when she was speaking of English language capacity or ability, I was trying to sound more Canadian. So I'm sure I've shared this with a lot of you. Some of you have heard this. And in my attempt to sound so fluent, I started saying to my husband to please focus. And we were with a group of people, focus, focus, focus. And then those poor people probably thinking I'm pervert or something, but I was trying to say focus. I was trying to sound, you know, anyway, but you know what I'm trying to say? If you're going to judge me based on how I pronounce things, then I'm doomed. People will be wondering why I'm even holding the social work title. But I mean, you know, like using sense of humor is also very helpful. Sometimes we find ourselves in a sticky situation or we've slipped up. Like, for example, I thought I was being so educated when I asked this woman who was physically, verbally abused, and I said to her, you know, why is it that you didn't leave? I asked her that, and she looked at me and she said, when will people stop asking why he didn't leave? When will people start asking why wouldn't he stop? Like, you know, those things, for us, the ability to be able to admit, okay, I made a mistake, I apologize. We need to actively solicit feedback from our clients. Okay, again, what I said earlier, I'm not very familiar with this situation, so please let me know if there's anything at all that has offended you with how I'm asking things. Just by being humble that way, injecting humility in our practice can go a long way in establishing trust and communication with our service recipients, no matter how they look, no matter, you know, what they wear, no matter how they say things. These are all very basic things that would help us a lot. And also, like, if we try to, you know, practice using strength-based perspective, always try to find, like, for example, the lady who has brought her 10-year-old daughter who weighs 100 pounds, the fact that she came forward asking for funding to help her child is a strength on her part. She wants to have a better life for the child than what she probably had, right? So instead of looking at it as, my goodness, it's your fault, you deserve it, then look at it as, she's coming, she's aware that she needed help, and she's coming forward. It takes a lot of courage to do that. And then the other thing too that I want to emphasize is, you know, treating people with equality and fairness. Like the example about prominence, this man who, 45-year-old male who's a prominent politician versus the 33-year-old male who's an inmate. I would probably view the inmate person as, you know, I'm scared because he might kill me if I turn my back. Maybe I should position myself in a way that I could exit right away, you know, if he attacks. And then when I look at the politician, maybe I would be so scared to even explain myself because, you know, wow, he's awesome. You know, I might have some repercussion if I say the wrong thing or not provide him what he wanted. But the bottom line is we can't afford to be biased this way. We can't afford to be prejudiced this way. Whether it's in our head, we need to provide the same service, whether Joe Blow here is prominent or whether Joe Blow here is not. Everything is equal because the minute that we let our own prejudice act out in terms of the services that we provide, then that's when we start facing, you know, ethical dilemmas in our practice. Like another example is cleanliness. You know, a lot of healthcare practitioners, especially in the community, that's a big, big issue. You'll read reports saying, okay, the house is dirty, not very clean. But then I would like to ask you, time is up. I would like to ask you, just one last thing. How do you define cleanliness? do you define cleanliness as free of clutter, or do you define cleanliness as in your house is sparkling? Like, you know, like a lot of these things, we need to be very careful and at the same time be open that we can be liable to make mistakes and do something about it, right? So, thank you.
Thank you. I think that was excellent, and conscious of the time now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open it up for questions, if anybody has any, because we just have that opportunity. Siobhan is there on the computer. If there's a question there, Siobhan, have you got one?
One is for George.
George, okay. Okay.
He starts with some very nice commentary, which I'll leave out, but very complimentary.
Thank you.
Having mentioned the oppression that you personally experienced, how has stereotypes impacted your ability to advance seniors' issues?
Just repeat a little bit of it then, George. So there were some compliments, by the way, of people saying, but they were asking about our own personal experiences.
So how did it impact
Choices.
sorry, what was the last? So how did it impact how I advance?
Has stereotypes impacted your ability to advance seniors' issues?
It helped me a lot because I find that I have deeper understanding of what it's like to be subjected to stereotypes, and that because of that I can empathize more with how older people who have been put in several boxes, you know, how I could reach out to them and how I could explain to other people, not just based on book knowledge, but on also what it feels like. So it's helped me a lot. Like, it does.
And it's interesting when we first pulled the panel together, and they said, and we know firsthand just from being a CFA, we didn't mention that one, that come from away label, but they all laughed, and they brought it up themselves, and that impact that's there.
That's right.
So
sorry, can
no.
I just add two specific examples? Just just to help you understand too. Like, for example, I was able to get a CEO job in Nova Scotia, and people would be saying, wow, you know, she's so educated, she's so good. However, I've also heard comments like, you know, maybe they have the affirmative action policy there, or maybe she's getting the job because they need to be well represented in terms of visible minority. You know, I can never win. Either I get it, or for example, I'm married to a Caucasian man, and you know, I know some people were saying, wow, good for you, and yet I also know for a fact that some people were saying, oh, maybe she married him for citizenship because she wants to be Canadian. You know, these kinds of situation, the dichotomy of whether you reach something or achieve something is always with a measure of maybe because of, right? So, and it's helping me a lot with advancing the, you know, my work with older people, because again, I understand what it's like.
I have a question up here.
This may not even be relevant, so just feel free to say so. But Jill, when you mentioned about the abuse things in the news recently, one of the things I thought you were going to bring up was the W5 presentation on the atrocious abuse of the elderly, that program. And I was just appalled at it, but I was almost just as appalled at the fact that there hasn't been anything, at least that I have heard, from the Canadian Medical Association, from the Canadian Nurses Association, from the Human Rights Commission, because this is obviously, you know, discrimination against elderly when the care is not in place to look after them, or the Social Worker Association. No one has come forth and said anything about this terrible situation. And it's not just the case. It's the W5 documented over 10,000 across the country. And that may not be, somebody was saying that, well, that don't happen here. Maybe the extent of it don't, but when you look at some of the situations in this province, you shake your head. Because we have a group of seniors, for example, in personal care homes. And there's no requirement for the personal care homes to have one person on with any training. And these are frail, elderly people. So where is the societal, I think, Carrie, you mentioned societal prejudice. Is it that we think that this group of people do not need appropriate care? Like, would you have any other target group of people in our society without adequate protection and care for them? Just a comment.
Thank you for that, and I'm conscious of the time, but I don't know if there's a general reflection that you want to make, or you certainly highlighted the situation quite well, so that awareness, I think we heard that, is a first step, bringing forth challenges to people to speak out.
Well, it's always the people who have the least voice, the people who have the least power, who are most subject to this kind of abuse. I think elder abuse has hit the radar of a lot of organizations. I think it's probably a muted response at this point, because whenever we have something like that, we all have to take responsibility for it if we flag it too carefully. But I think certainly physicians and nurses and social workers are aware of elder abuse, and I'm sure there are probably things being put in place. But yeah, I mean, it is shocking to see the extent to which that expose brought it to the fore.
Siobhan, I believe you have one more question there.
This question is for Carrie. For an individual that feels that they're being discriminated against because of their sexual orientation, for example, how does the Human Rights Commission support that individual when they're fighting against a large organization?
Well, as I described briefly in my presentation, like, we wouldn't go and advocate with that person when they're fighting the organization, but what we would do is, if they felt that they had reasonable grounds, they could file a complaint and it would work its way through our legal process. We're really supposed to be seen as being as independent as possible, and even though I know that this happens all the time in the workplace, it's certainly something that would have to work through our process, rather than us going and advocating as if we were, like, say, a human rights association or something like that.
For the questions? Okay, I think we'll bring it to a close because of the timing. We did have, I'm sure they have a few more notes or comments, but I'll let you come down to the front and speak to them, or contact us, and we'll provide information as appropriate to connect with some of these, or go to your own organizations to ask questions. There's different committees and structures around in every single regional health authority or in the public system, so there's all kinds of opportunities to dig in there. I mean, the goal of today's education session was to highlight some of the stereotypes that are perpetuated in society, but also in our communities and in our organizations, and more specifically in our practice. Change starts with us. And I think that was one of the message. And I think the second message was change starts with awareness. And I think the speakers did a phenomenal job of bringing that awareness to the forefront. I think they've also given us some resources, to think about, and simple things like step back and ask, how do you say a name? It's something that is easy to do, but you know what is huge? It's huge. It shows respect. So I think there's a full range of resources that have been provided today. As I said, there's evaluation forms here. We'd like for you to get your feedback. There's evaluation forms on our website. So again, I'd like your thoughts for the next session. And this has been a webcast, and it's recorded. So it will be a DVD that we'll actually upload to our website. So if you think this is a good opportunity for somebody else to have heard, or have been able to capture elements of this, you certainly can have the opportunity when we get the DVD, and so give us a couple of weeks by the time we get it and get it uploaded. It will be available for you to listen to again. So we thank you on behalf of the Association of Registered Nurses of Newfoundland and Labrador, on behalf of the Newfoundland and Labrador Association of Social Workers, and our sponsors, Munn School of Nursing and the Newfoundland and Labrador Health Boards Association, and a particular huge thanks to a fabulous panel, guys. Thank you so much, and have a good day. The evaluations, you want to go?